Welcome. Tonight we will listen to new horror stories accompanied by the sound of rain. Don't forget to click the like button and subscribe for more stories. Now relax and enjoy these scary tales. I worked in an office and sometimes had to work late to get a head start on the next day's tasks. But that never bothered me. On a certain night, everything seemed different. The empty office, the silence, and even the sense of fatigue that enveloped me. Finally, when the clock struck almost midnight, I decided it was time to go home. I drove through the quiet streets of my small town, longing for the safety and comfort of my home. However, upon parking in the garage, a sense of unease began to creep over me. The house was completely dark except for a faint light coming from the upstairs. And that wasn't the strangest part. I usually left some lights on before leaving, and all of them were off. I turned off the engine and sat in the car for a moment, trying to figure out that light. I didn't remember leaving any light on upstairs. I took a deep breath, trying to push away the bad thoughts forming in my mind. Finally, I got out of the car and walked to the front door. I opened the door and entered the house, feeling the familiar smell of wood and coffee that always calmed me. But this time, the smell seemed different. I looked around, trying to understand what was wrong. The darkness was almost complete, and the faint light upstairs was the only thing breaking the house's darkness. I started to sweat cold. At that point, I knew something was definitely wrong. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step creaking under my weight. The faint light grew closer, and with it, the feeling of fear increased. When I reached the top of the stairs, I realized the light was coming from my bedroom. I heard hurried footsteps from inside the bedroom, and suddenly, a door slammed shut. My heart skipped a beat, and I stood still, frozen, trying to hear any other sound. There was nothing else after that, just silence. Approaching the bedroom door, I tried to open it slowly, but it was locked. I applied light force, and the door gave way with a loud creak, revealing an empty room except for a flashlight on the floor. The yellow light created an even more sinister atmosphere. I entered the room and looked around. The drawers were open, and it looked like someone had rummaged through my things. My stomach turned at the realization that a stranger had been there, going through my personal belongings. I picked up the flashlight and examined it. It was simple and cheap, the kind you find in any neighborhood store. I went back to the hallway, feeling a mix of fear and anger. Someone had been in my house, and I didn't know if they were still there. With the flashlight in hand, I started to descend the stairs again, trying not to make any noise. At the bottom of the stairs, I heard a noise coming from the kitchen. It was a low sound, but clear. The sound of someone fiddling with something. My mind was racing, and I knew I needed to do something. I decided to hide behind the living room door, peeking to see what was happening. I saw a shadow moving slowly in the kitchen. The intruder was trying to be quiet, but not quiet enough. Panic started to take hold of me, but I knew I had to stay calm. I grabbed my phone and tried to call the police, but when I put the phone to my ear, I realized there was no signal. The line was dead. The shadow in the kitchen continued to move, and I knew I had to act before the intruder noticed my presence. Fear almost paralyzed me, but adrenaline pushed me forward. Slowly, I crept towards the kitchen door, trying not to make any noise. I peeked again and saw the shadow approaching the kitchen table. The intruder seemed to be looking for something specific. Each movement was methodical, making the situation even more frightening. Without the possibility of calling the police, my options were limited. I looked around the living room for something I could use as a weapon, but everything seemed inadequate. Then I remembered the old back door lock, which could trap the intruder outside. I started moving towards the kitchen, keeping the flashlight off to avoid drawing attention. When I was a few meters from the entrance, I heard a louder noise, as if the intruder had knocked something over. I took advantage of the distraction and quickly moved to the back door. When I got there, I saw the intruder, a tall man, dressed in dark clothes, carefully trying to open the door. I held my breath and, in one swift motion, slammed the door shut with a bang. The man turned, surprised, and our eyes met for a second. Without thinking, I locked the door and backed away, trying to block any exit. The intruder started pounding on the door. I grabbed my phone again and ran upstairs, where the signal might be better. The sound of pounding on the door grew fainter, but the fear still accompanied me. Reaching the bedroom, I realized the phone finally had a signal. I dialed the police number and waited. The operator's voice brought immediate relief, but the tension was still there. I quickly explained the situation, asking for help. The police promised to arrive in a few minutes. I ran to the bedroom window and saw the red and blue lights reflecting off the walls of the neighboring houses. The police were here. I hurried downstairs. The officers entered quickly, guns drawn, and I pointed towards the back door. They moved with precision, one staying with me while the other two advanced to capture the intruder. I heard commands shouted and then the sound of the door opening. There was a brief struggle, but soon silence returned, interrupted only by the muffled sounds of handcuffs being secured. One of the officers appeared in the living room, bringing the intruder, now handcuffed and with a look of defeat on his face. He walked past me, and our eyes met once again. This time, he was the one who looked away. The sense of relief was so intense that I almost fainted. I was very close to my mother. Life kind of forced us to connect even more since it had been just the two of us for a long time without my father around. The apartment where I lived with my mother was in the middle of downtown. It was an old building with narrow corridors and dim lighting. The bulbs always flickered as if they were on the verge of going out for good. Living there had never bothered me. We would watch TV together every night until my mother started working night shifts. I had always been independent, used to being alone some nights. My mother now left around 8 and returned only in the early morning. During her absences, I kept busy with schoolwork and video games. But lately, an uncomfortable feeling had been growing inside me. The noises in the hallway seemed louder and more frequent, and those flickering lights seemed to blink more often. One specific night, after my mother left for work, fear began to take hold of me. I remember sitting on the living room sofa, trying to concentrate on a book I read occasionally, but the sounds in the hallway wouldn't leave me alone. The sound of footsteps, sometimes light and sometimes heavier, echoed through the thin apartment walls. The fear made me question if being alone there was really safe. That night, the sounds seemed even closer and wouldn't stop. I decided I couldn't focus on anything until I investigated. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and cautiously approached the apartment door. The hallway seemed darker than usual, the lights flickering in a disturbing manner. I heard a different sound, like something heavy being dragged. After taking a deep breath, I opened the door, letting the flashlight illuminate the dark corridor. I started walking, trying to make as little noise as possible. As I advanced, the sound became clearer. It seemed to come from the end of the corridor, where there was a broken window I always glimpsed when leaving the house. The window, usually covered with patched-up plastic, was open, swaying slightly in the wind. I found it strange the moment I looked. I approached the window and noticed dirt marks on its frame. Someone had been there recently. I heard movement behind me and quickly turned around, the flashlight shaking in my hand. But fortunately, I saw nothing, just shadows cast by the flickering lights. Suddenly, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something. I turned the flashlight and saw a man in torn, dirty clothes leaning against the wall, watching me. At that moment, I was startled and could barely keep the flashlight steady. "What are you doing here?" I asked him. The man didn't answer, just took a step towards me. I fought the urge to run and instead backed away slowly, keeping the flashlight on him. I grabbed my phone and dialed the police number, trying to explain the situation as calmly as possible, although my voice revealed the fear I was feeling. While I waited for the police, the man continued to approach, one step at a time, his eyes fixed on me. There was something disturbing in his gaze, as if he wasn't fully present. The flashlight's beam trembled as I backed towards my apartment. The man muttered words I couldn't understand. When he was only a few meters away, he suddenly stopped and started laughing, a grotesque sound echoing through the building's empty corridors. I heard quick footsteps coming up the stairs, and for a moment, I felt relieved. The police were arriving, but before I could feel completely safe, the man made one last quick dash and grabbed my arm. His grip was strong and desperate, and the smell of dirt and sweat filled my nostrils. "Help me, please," he whispered. I was torn between fear and compassion, but there was no time to think. Two officers appeared in the corridor, guns drawn. One of them shouted for the man to let go of me. The man released my arm and raised his hands, but his eyes were still pleading. The officers moved quickly, handcuffing him and starting to ask questions. I retreated into the apartment, closing the door behind me. My body trembled uncontrollably as I leaned against the wall, trying to process what had just happened. The next morning, my mother came home from work earlier than usual. The police had already left, and the homeless man had been taken to a shelter. I told her everything that happened during the night, still trembling as I recalled the events. She hugged me tightly, promising she wouldn't leave me alone at night anymore. In the following days, my mother found a new job that didn't require night shifts. The security I felt in her presence was comforting, and gradually, the feeling of fear began to dissipate. The old building and the dark corridors remained the same, but I knew I was no longer alone to face the noises of the night. I never imagined that my life would take such a drastic turn at 27. After a painful divorce, I decided to leave everything behind and move to an isolated house in the countryside. The relationship had been an emotional roller coaster, and I needed a fresh start, a place where I could find peace and reconnect with myself. The house was an old stone building situated in the middle of a vast green field. Around it, only trees and the constant sound of the wind blowing through the leaves. It was the perfect contrast to the hectic life I had left behind in the city. Here, solitude seemed like a balm for my emotional wounds. The first days were spent exploring the house and the surroundings. There was a rustic charm in every room, with solid wood furniture and a fireplace that seemed to invite cozy nights with a good book. I spent my mornings walking through the fields, listening to the birds singing and smelling the fresh scent of nature. The house had an abandoned garden that I began to tend to, hoping to restore it to its former glory. Despite the isolation, the tranquility was exactly what I was looking for. The simple routine and the natural beauty around me began to fill the void I felt. Each day, I felt a little stronger, a little more capable of facing the future. The nights in the house started to become increasingly unsettling. At first, it was just small noises, so subtle that I could almost ignore them. A creak here, a thud there, things that any old house would make, I convinced myself. But as the days passed, the sounds began to intensify. One night, while I was reading in the living room, I heard a distinct noise coming from upstairs. My heart raced, but I tried to calm myself. It was probably just the wind or maybe a rat in the attic. I went to the stairs and called out loudly, hoping that the sound of my own voice would bring me comfort. No response. I decided I was being paranoid and went back to my book, although my concentration was completely shattered. The feeling of being watched began to haunt me. During the day, everything seemed normal, but at night, the darkness seemed to take on a life of its own. I started to notice things out of place. A window I was sure I had closed was open. A chair moved a few centimeters from its usual position. Small things that, individually, meant nothing but together formed a disturbing pattern. One of those nights, I woke up to the distinct sound of footsteps in the hallway. I was so scared that I could barely breathe. I grabbed a flashlight and, trembling, walked through the house. Every corner was empty, but the discomfort remained, stronger than ever. I went back to bed, but sleeping became impossible. The situation worsened when I started finding clear signs that someone had been inside the house. One morning, I found dirty footprints in the hallway leading to the attic. I tried to rationalize, thinking it could be some animal, but deep down, I knew something was terribly wrong. The final straw came when I found a message scribbled on the bathroom mirror with my lipstick. "I'm watching you." My blood ran cold. Whoever it was, they were playing with me, enjoying my growing fear. Without hesitation, I called the police. I explained the situation with a trembling voice, and they promised to send a car immediately. I waited in the car, locked, listening to every sound of the night with my heart in my throat. The minutes following my call to the police felt like hours. I was locked in the car, with the headlights off, trying to stay calm while listening to the sounds of the night. Finally, I saw the lights of the patrol car approaching and felt immediate relief. 2 officers got out of the car and came to me. I quickly explained the situation, and they immediately began to search the house. I waited outside, my heart still racing. After what felt like an eternity, I heard the officers calling to each other. They had found something. I headed towards the house, my legs trembling, and one of the officers gently held my arm, preventing me from entering. "We found someone in the attic," he said with a grave expression. My blood froze. The other officer came down the stairs with a man in handcuffs. He was disheveled, with wide eyes and an expression that oscillated between fury and despair. I recognized him immediately. He was a former schoolmate, a man I barely remembered but who apparently had never forgotten me. During the interrogation, he revealed a disturbing obsession that dated back to our school days. He had been following me, watching from a distance, and when he learned of my divorce, he decided it was the right time to get closer. He had been in the house for days, hiding in the attic, waiting for the perfect opportunity to. I didn't even want to think about what he might have done. The police took him away, and I stood there in shock as the sun began to rise on the horizon. The horror of that night finally dissipated with the daylight, but the feeling of violation and fear still enveloped me. With the help of the officers, I went into the house and gathered some of my things. There was no way I could continue living there. The idea of returning to the city, which once seemed like surrender, now seemed like the only sensible choice. I needed to be in a place where I felt safe, surrounded by people. As I drove back to the city, I thought about everything that had happened. The search for peace and solitude had turned into a nightmare. However, this episode also taught me something important. The security and support of those around me were vital. Perhaps the true fresh start wasn't in the solitude of the countryside, but in the ability to rebuild my life surrounded by those who cared about me. Working as a pizza delivery driver at night can be both exciting and exhausting. My name is Daniel, and I've been on the job for less than a year. The pizzeria I work for is small but always busy, especially on weekends. The night shifts are the most challenging, but I prefer them because the tips are usually better. My colleague, Josh, is responsible for making the pizzas. He's older and has years of kitchen experience. I admire him for the speed and precision with which he can make multiple pizzas at once. While he stays in the kitchen, I handle the deliveries, navigating the dark streets of the city. It was a Friday night, and the pizzeria was a madhouse. Orders were piling up, and everyone was already exhausted. Josh, sweating, could barely keep up, while I rushed back and forth, trying to organize the deliveries. The phone kept ringing, and the line of customers seemed endless. "Daniel, this one's urgent. Take it to the Sunset Motel on the highway," Josh said, handing me a still-hot pizza. The Sunset Motel was known to be a shady place, with a seedy environment frequented by strange people. I took the pizza and left, feeling a slight apprehension in my chest. I had made deliveries to that motel before, but something about that night felt different. The rush at the pizzeria, the hurry, the fatigue, everything contributed to a sense of unease that I couldn't shake off. I drove along the dark road to the Sunset Motel, feeling the tension increase with every mile. When I arrived, I noticed the parking lot was busier than usual. Several people were entering and leaving the rooms, creating a sense of controlled chaos. I parked the car near the entrance and grabbed the pizza. I walked to the room indicated on the order. I knocked on the door, and after a few seconds, a man opened it. He looked nervous, with wide eyes and trembling hands. I handed over the pizza, and he quickly gave me the money, avoiding any eye contact. The feeling of unease intensified. Something was definitely wrong. As I counted the money and prepared to return to my car, I heard quick footsteps behind me. I turned around and saw a woman running towards me, visibly panicked. "Please help me," she begged, grabbing my arm. "I'm running away from someone very dangerous." I looked around, trying to understand the situation. The woman was frightened, with wide eyes and a trembling body. She seemed genuinely terrified. "Calm down. Let's call the police," I said, trying to stay calm. I led her to my car and called 911, explaining the situation as best I could. While we waited for the police to arrive, she told me she was being pursued by a violent man who was also staying at the motel. Every minute felt like an eternity. Finally, the police sirens approached, and a patrol car parked next to us. The officers acted quickly, taking the woman to a safe place and starting to investigate the motel. The arrival of the police brought a mix of relief and anxiety. The officers spread out through the motel, checking the rooms and talking to the guests. Meanwhile, I stayed in the car, watching everything closely. The woman I had helped was taken to a safe place, still visibly shaken. After some time, one of the officers approached me. "Thank you for calling us," he said. The woman was running from a dangerous assailant, a man with a long history of violence. Fortunately, we were able to catch him before something worse happened. I felt a chill run down my spine hearing that. The idea of having been so close to such a dangerous situation made me reconsider many things. I thanked the officer and drove back to the pizzeria, still processing everything that had happened. When I got back to the pizzeria, Josh noticed my expression and asked what had happened. I told him everything, from the strange behavior of the man to the woman's desperation and the arrival of the police. He listened attentively, shaking his head. "That's crazy, man. You should talk to the boss about this," Josh suggested. I am a single father struggling every day to support my daughter, Clara. I work as a food delivery driver, a job that doesn't pay much but allows me to take care of her. Clara is only 6 years old, a sweet and intelligent girl who is the light of my life. Each day starts early and ends late, with long hours on the road delivering meals to people I barely know. Since Clara was born, my main concern has been safety. I never accept deliveries in known dangerous areas, and I always try to finish my shift before nightfall. In a big and chaotic city, you never know what can happen. My routine is simple but full of love and responsibility. Clara and I have our precious moments together, reading bedtime stories and playing on weekends. She makes me promise that I will always come home, and I keep that promise with all my heart. However, life is full of surprises, and we can't always control what lies ahead. That night, as I was almost finishing my shift, I received a large order that caught my attention. It was for a remote part of the city, far from the areas I usually considered safe. The tip amount was tempting, enough to cover some extra expenses Clara and I had recently accumulated. For a moment, I hesitated. My instinct told me to refuse, but the financial need spoke louder. I decided to accept the order, assuring myself that it would be quick and that I would take all precautions. As I drove through the dark and deserted roads, I began to feel a growing sense of unease. The GPS led me down a narrow, winding path that eventually ended in front of an old, dilapidated house. The house looked like it had been abandoned for years, with broken windows and peeling paint. There were no lights on, and everything around was shrouded in an unsettling darkness. I parked the car and sat there for a moment, wondering if I should just leave. But then my phone rang. "Please come in and leave the food on the kitchen table," said a raspy voice on the other end of the line. "The door is open." A feeling of dread ran down my spine, but I decided to go ahead. I walked slowly to the door and pushed it open, finding it unlocked as the customer had said. Upon entering, a strong smell of mold and dampness hit me. The walls were covered in strange symbols, written in a language I didn't know. Something was very wrong there. As I advanced through the house, the noises began. Sounds of shuffling footsteps and unintelligible whispers came from all directions. My heart was pounding, and adrenaline took over. I needed to get out of there as quickly as possible, but before I could react, a masked figure appeared out of nowhere, attacking me with surprising force. The masked man attacked me with a force I hadn't expected. I fell to the floor, trying to protect myself as he brandished a knife at me. Instinctively, I rolled to the side, avoiding the first strike. The blade grazed my arm, causing a searing pain. I knew I had to fight with all my strength to get out of there. With difficulty, I got up and shoved the attacker with all my might, making him stagger backward. I took advantage of his hesitation and ran toward the exit, but he quickly recovered and came after me. The pain from the cut on my arm was becoming unbearable, and blood was dripping, but the determination to get back to Clara pushed me forward. I managed to reach the kitchen and, with one last desperate effort, threw a chair at my attacker. This gave me enough time to reach the front door and get out of the house. I ran toward my car, feeling the weight of exhaustion and fear in every step. Behind me, I could hear the furious shouts of the masked man, but I didn't look back. When I got to the car, my hands were shaking so much that I could barely grab the keys. I finally managed to unlock the door and threw myself into the driver's seat, locking all the doors immediately. I started the car and drove away as fast as I could. The road back seemed endless, but I didn't stop until I was in a safe place. I took out my phone and called the police, reporting the attack. The minutes that followed were a blur of sirens and flashing lights. The police arrived quickly, and I was taken to the hospital to treat my injuries. The cut on my arm required stitches, and the doctor said I would have a permanent scar. However, the emotional scars were much deeper. Clara was asleep when I got home, and I hugged her with all the strength I had left. That night, I made the decision to change jobs. I could no longer risk my life that way. I promised myself that I would find a safer way to support my daughter, away from the dangers that had almost taken me from her. Today, the memories of that attack still haunt me, but every day I spend with Clara reminds me of what truly matters. Her safety and well-being are my priority, and I will do everything to protect her, even if it means carrying scars that will never fade. The pandemic brought unexpected changes for everyone, and I was no exception. Newly graduated, I was enjoying my free time before starting a permanent job, but boredom began to set in. The idea of working as a delivery driver seemed perfect. I could explore the city, discover new areas, and make some extra money. Little did I know that this decision would change my life forever. My routine was simple. Wake up early, grab my bike, and start the deliveries. With each order, a new destination, a new discovery. That's how I came across the abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. At first, it seemed like any other place, despite its rundown appearance. I didn't ask questions. I just delivered the packages and went on my way. The recipients were always the same. A group of middle-aged men with expressionless faces and cold stares. They never exchanged more than a few words with me. However, something always bothered me about that place. A feeling I couldn't explain. As the weeks went by, I started noticing a disturbing pattern. With each visit to the warehouse, different women appeared on the property. They never interacted with me, always keeping their distance, with furtive looks and scared expressions. I tried not to think too much about it, but the feeling that something was wrong kept haunting me. One night, I received a delivery request for the warehouse, later than usual. The city was deserted, the streets illuminated only by flickering streetlights. When I arrived at the warehouse, I noticed unusual activity. The men were more tense, whispering among themselves in low voices. As I waited for someone to come and pick up the package, I felt a light touch on my arm. I turned quickly and saw one of the women, a young woman with wide eyes, whispering desperately to me, "Please help us. Call the police. They keep us here against our will." Before I could respond, she disappeared into the darkness, blending with the shadows of the warehouse. My heart raced. What I had just heard confirmed my worst fears. I decided to act quickly but without raising suspicion. I delivered the package as usual and left as fast as I could. As soon as I got away from the warehouse, my mind was racing. I needed to help those women, but any wrong move could put everyone in danger, including myself. I found a safe place and, with trembling hands, dialed the police number. "Police, what is the emergency?" I need to report a kidnapping. There are a group of women being held against their will in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts. Please, send someone quickly." While I waited, time seemed to drag on. Every minute felt like an eternity. I hid near the warehouse, close enough to see the activity but without being seen. My heart was pounding, and my breathing was heavy. In no time, the sirens began to echo through the night, bringing a mix of relief and tension. I saw the blue and red lights reflecting off the warehouse walls. Several officers got out of the cars, guns drawn, ready to act. The approach was swift and efficient. I heard shouts and commands being given, followed by the unmistakable sound of handcuffs being put on. One of the officers approached me, probably realizing I was the one who had made the call. "Are you okay? Were you the one who called us?" I nodded, still trying to process everything that was happening. She asked me a few quick questions and then asked me to wait while they handled the situation inside the warehouse. Minutes later, I saw the women coming out one by one, supported by the police officers. The young woman who had asked for help saw me and, with tears in her eyes, thanked me. "You saved us. We will never forget this." The feeling of relief was overwhelming. I had done the right thing, and those women were finally free. The men were arrested, and the investigation revealed a horrific human trafficking operation that had been going on there for months. Thanks to my actions, Many lives were saved, and those criminals would face justice. It was past 2 a.m., and I was in the back room of the toy factory, surrounded by the familiar hum of machines. As a maintenance technician with years of experience in industrial machinery, this was my domain. I preferred the night shift. There was something about the quiet and the absence of human movement that allowed me to concentrate better on my work. The factory, deserted at that hour, was a stark contrast to its usual daytime chaos. The production areas, usually filled with workers and the constant sound of toys being assembled, were now immersed in an almost sepulchral calm. Only the emergency lights and a few machines continued to operate, casting long, sinister shadows on the walls. I appreciated the tranquility of the night. With a young child at home, the factory's silence was a welcome relief after a day full of laughter and crying. But that night, the silence felt denser, almost palpable. As I adjusted one of the large assembly machines, an unexpected noise interrupted my concentration. Children's laughter echoed through the factory. It was soft but unmistakable. I stopped and looked around, but saw nothing unusual. It must be my imagination, I thought, returning to my work. However, I couldn't shake the chill that ran down my spine. Something didn't feel right. I focused again on the machine, trying to ignore the laughter echoing through the factory. But as the minutes passed, the sounds became more frequent and disturbing. What initially seemed like an auditory illusion began to transform into something more tangible and unsettling. Suddenly, I noticed something that made my heart stop for a second. One of the toys, a small wooden car that had been on a shelf at the other end of the room, was now at my feet. I was sure it hadn't been there before. I picked up the car and put it back on the shelf, trying to push away the feeling of unease. However, when I turned around, I saw another toy out of place. A rag doll that should have been in one of the storage boxes was now sitting in an operator's chair. A chill ran down my spine, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I picked up the doll, intending to lock it in a cabinet. However, when I turned around, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A porcelain doll stood in the middle of the room, staring directly at me. The doll was large, with glass eyes that seemed to follow my movements. I didn't remember seeing it before. My heart began to beat faster as I cautiously approached it. I picked up the doll and, with a nervous impulse, threw it into the industrial trash bin and slammed the lid shut. But my relief was short-lived. When I turned back to my work, there it was again in the same spot, staring at me. A deep fear took hold of me. I grabbed the doll and threw it against the wall with all my strength, hoping it would break. However, it fell to the floor without a scratch, its eyes fixed on me. I tried locking the doll in a cabinet, but every time I thought I was rid of it, it would reappear always closer, always staring directly at me. The feeling of being pursued grew stronger with every second. I decided I couldn't stay there any longer. I needed to get out of that factory. I grabbed my things and ran toward the exit, but the toys seemed to be everywhere, watching, laughing. And the doll, always the doll, was there, following me. I ran toward the factory exit, my heart pounding like a drum. Every step I took seemed to be accompanied by the sinister sound of laughter and toys moving on their own. The doll was following me, appearing at every corner, every hallway, always closer. The exit door finally appeared in front of me, and I ran with all my might. The factory, once a place of quiet work, now seemed like a nightmare labyrinth. I tripped over a toy cart that mysteriously appeared in my path, almost falling, but I managed to recover and kept running. When I reached the door, I found it locked. I tried to open it with the key, but my hands were shaking so much it seemed impossible. Behind me, I heard the sound of small, quick footsteps. The doll was getting closer. With one last desperate effort, I managed to unlock the door and threw myself outside, feeling the cold night air hit my face. I ran through the parking lot, not looking back, until I felt safe enough to stop and look back at the factory. There she was, standing at the entrance, staring at me with her glass eyes. But then, suddenly, she disappeared. I looked around, searching for any sign of her, but the doll was gone. I knew I couldn't stay there. I drove home, my body still trembling and my mind trying to process what had happened. When I got home, I entered quietly, trying not to wake my son. But even in the comfort of my home, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. Every time I heard a noise or saw a toy out of place, my heart would race. I knew that the possessed doll could appear at any moment, anywhere. Fear became a constant companion, and I lived with the certainty that I would never be truly safe. The doll had disappeared, but the feeling of being watched remained, like a sinister mark on my life. I used to be an IT analyst. I worked for a large company, dealing with servers, networks, and troubleshooting technical issues. But one day I was caught off guard by staff cuts. The company was facing financial difficulties, and unfortunately, I was one of those chosen to be let go. With bills to pay and the growing pressure to find a new source of income, I accepted a job as a night security guard at a local shopping mall. The mall was enormous, with numerous corridors that seemed to go on forever. During the day, it was a lively place, full of people shopping, children running, and laughter echoing through the halls. At night, however, the atmosphere changed completely. The lights were dim, the corridors empty. The feeling of loneliness was intense, but I needed the money and didn't have many options. Working at night was challenging. The silence and solitude were hard to bear. I spent most of my shift walking through the corridors, checking doors and windows, and monitoring the security cameras. There was something unsettling about those cameras. The grainy black and white images showed an empty mall, but sometimes I felt like something was moving in the shadows, just out of the camera's reach. In the third week on the job, things started to get strange. I began to hear inexplicable noises. They were subtle sounds, like distant footsteps or whispers coming from the abandoned corridors. Every time I went to check, I found nothing. Initially, I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me, a consequence of the lonely nights and monotony. The security cameras, which had previously only shown the mall's emptiness and tranquility at night, began to capture something more. Small movements in the shadows, as if someone was there, but always just out of clear view of the lenses. I reviewed the recordings multiple times, trying to find a rational explanation, but I couldn't. One night, during my break, I sat in the security office to have some coffee and rest a bit. That's when I saw a strange figure on the camera screens. A man, dressed in a dark coat, was standing in the middle of one of the corridors. He seemed to be looking directly at the camera, making my heart race. I grabbed my flashlight and headed to the location where the man was. When I got there, he was gone. I walked through the corridors, calling out for him, but received no response. Back in the security office, I reviewed the recordings. The man had appeared out of nowhere and disappeared as quickly as he had appeared. It was unsettling. The following days were even more disturbing. The man's figure started appearing more frequently on the cameras. He walked through the corridors, always avoiding being clearly captured by the lenses. One night, while making my usual rounds, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned quickly, but no one was there. The feeling of being watched grew with each shift. Then, finally, came the confrontation. During one of my rounds, I heard a loud noise, like metal clashing. I ran in the direction of the sound and found the man trying to force his way into one of the stores. I confronted him, demanding that he stop. He turned slowly, revealing a sinister smile. "You shouldn't have gotten involved in this," he murmured. The intruder advanced toward me, and I backed away, trying to keep a safe distance. He was armed with a metal bar, and his eyes were full of hatred. My heart pounded in my chest, but I knew I had to confront him. I used my flashlight to try and disorient him, but he seemed relentless. The struggle that followed was intense. He attacked with the metal bar, and I defended myself as best I could, using the flashlight as an improvised shield. I managed to disarm him after a brief scuffle, knocking the metal bar to the ground. Before he could react, I was able to immobilize him and call the police. When the police arrived, they took him into custody and began investigating his identity. That's when I discovered the shocking truth. The intruder was a former coworker, someone I hadn't seen in years. His name was Marcos, and he had also been laid off from the IT company where we worked together. Marcos had blamed me for his dismissal. In his words, I had pulled the rug out from under him. Though I had no idea what he was talking about, he had harbored this anger and resentment for years, until he decided to take revenge. Using a false identity, he managed to infiltrate the mall and plan his attack. Marcos was arrested, and the mall returned to its quiet night routine. But for me, nothing went back to normal. The feeling of insecurity remained. Every noise, every shadow on the security cameras reminded me of that night. The loneliness and silence of the nights at the mall became even more oppressive. I began to question my choice of working as a night security guard. The money was necessary, but peace of mind was priceless. Even with Marcos behind bars, I knew that the scars from that experience would stay with me. I have been a nurse for over a decade and have always prided myself on my dedication and empathy for patients. Since childhood, I knew I wanted to care for people, relieve their pain, and bring comfort in difficult times. When the opportunity arose to work the night shift at an old hospital, I accepted without hesitation. The experience would be valuable, and the flexible schedule would allow me to spend more time with my family during the day. Additionally, I have always been skeptical about the supernatural, so the ghost stories circulating about the hospital did not intimidate me. On my first night, as I entered the hospital, I felt a chill down my spine. The building was imposing, with long corridors and walls that seemed to whisper ancient secrets. I was greeted by a few colleagues, all with tired but friendly eyes. During the break, I heard several stories about strange events occurring in the hospital at night. Footsteps echoing in empty corridors, voices whispering in the shadows, and medical equipment that seemed to come to life on its own. I discreetly laughed at these stories, attributing them to the fertile imagination of my tired colleagues. However, upon returning to my post, I began to notice small things that unsettled me. A patient's heart monitor flickered for no apparent reason, even though it was turned off. The sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor, but when I went to check, there was no one there. I took a deep breath and shook my head, trying to dismiss the growing discomfort. After all, they were just coincidences, right? The nights became increasingly disturbing. The strange sounds not only continued but increased in frequency and intensity. Medical equipment such as heart monitors and infusion machines turned on by themselves, their lights flashing in a sinister pattern. One night, while doing rounds, I saw a figure in the distance, standing at the end of the corridor. My heart raced. I walked quickly towards it, but when I got there, no one was there. The reports from my colleagues became more vivid and detailed. Clara, a nurse with over 20 years of experience, told me about a time she saw a dark shadow pass through a wall. "This is not imagination, dear. Something in this hospital does not want to be forgotten." she said, her eyes shining with a mix of fear and resignation. I began to question my own sanity. Was fatigue playing tricks on my mind? But the events were too real to be mere hallucinations. One night, I woke up from a nightmare, drenched in sweat, with the sensation of being watched. Sleep became scarce, and the nights at work turned into a constant torment. I decided I needed to investigate. If something was happening, I needed to find out the truth. The following night, during my rounds, I saw the mysterious figure again. It moved quickly, but I managed to follow it to the basement. With a flashlight in hand and the courage of someone with nothing left to lose, I descended the old, creaky stairs. The basement was a labyrinth of dark, musty corridors. My hands trembled, and each step echoed like a drum. At the end of one corridor, I found a locked door. Forcing the handle, the door opened with a creak, revealing a secret wing that seemed untouched for decades. The smell of mold and dampness was almost unbearable. Inside, I found old files and outdated medical equipment. In the center of the room, a hospital bed covered in dust. As I approached, I saw a diary on the pillow. The yellowed pages told the story of a young patient who died tragically after a medical error. Her presence seemed to permeate every corner of that place, a restless soul trapped between this world and the next. My eyes were fixed on the diary when I felt a presence behind me. I turned slowly, and there she was, the mysterious figure I had seen so many times. It was a young woman, dressed in an old hospital uniform, with pale skin and eyes filled with indescribable sadness. The air around her was cold, and a shiver ran down my spine. You are real?" My voice came out as a whisper. She did not respond with words, but her eyes met mine, and somehow I knew what she wanted. I picked up the diary again and began to read the last pages. It told the story of Helena, a patient who was admitted with a severe illness. During an emergency procedure, a medical error cost her life. The responsible doctor tried to cover up the incident, locking the wing and hiding the records. Helena, trapped between the world of the living and the dead, sought justice. Her pain was palpable, and at that moment, I felt a deep connection with her suffering. I understood that the inexplicable events in the hospital were manifestations of her anguish and desire to be remembered. I closed the diary and looked at her with empathy. "I am sorry for what happened to you. I will do what I can to make the truth known," I promised. She watched me for a long moment before slowly disappearing, leaving a sense of peace in the air. I knew she could finally rest. The next day, I took the diary to the hospital administrator and explained what I had discovered. Investigations were reopened, and Helena's story was finally revealed. The past mistakes were exposed, and measures were taken to prevent something like this from happening again. Although I felt I had helped bring justice to Helena, the experience left me deeply shaken. Every corridor in the hospital reminded me of the tragedy I had uncovered. I decided to request a transfer to the day shift, needing light and life around me to overcome the trauma. As I packed my things on my last night shift, I thought about how the experience had changed my perception of the supernatural and the importance of giving a voice to those who can no longer speak for themselves. I felt that, despite everything, I emerged from this experience stronger and more determined to be an advocate for my patients, living or dead.